The year is 1850, and you're lying on an operating table. You survived the amputation. Congratulations. But now your leg stump smells like death, and your fever's spiking. Your doctor seems optimistic, because the wound is covered in pus. Doctors refused to change aprons or wash their hands. Instruments were crusted with blood. Wounds were packed with dirty rags. And when patients inevitably died, no one blamed the doctor. Because in the 19th century, disease came from bad air. Dirty tools and bloody coats were signs of experience. Pus was proof that the body was healing. And germs, they didn't exist yet. This is the story of why 19th century doctors didn't wash their hands, and how thousands died before medicine finally admitted it might be the problem. Let's rewind to the early 1800s, a time when doctors believed in bad air rather than bacteria. Back then, the explanation for disease was miasma theory, the idea that illness came from foul vapors floating through the air, especially in places like swamps or sewers. The word miasma translates to pollution in ancient Greek. The idea was that you could catch diseases from breathing in rotten organic material. Transmission of diseases wasn't a thing. People would all get sick in the same area because naturally they were all in the area with the bad air. Invisible microorganisms invading the body? That sounded like science fiction, or witchcraft. So, cleanliness wasn't just ignored, it was considered irrelevant. If anything, filth was part of the aesthetic. Surgeons wore the same blood-soaked coats for every operation, not because they were too lazy to do laundry, but because those stains were badges of honor. The more crusty blood on your apron, the more experience you clearly had. A spotless coat just meant you weren't doing enough cutting. Some even prided themselves on how stiff their garments were from dried bodily fluids, and they didn't even wash their hands. Not after dissecting corpses, not after draining abscesses, not before delivering babies, just straight from the morgue to the maternity ward. As for wounds, they were supposed to get nasty. Pus was seen as a good thing, called laudable pus, a sign the body was healing properly. In reality, it was often a sign that you were headed towards a swift and unpleasant death by infection. Even instruments weren't cleaned between patients. Why bother? Disease didn't spread from hands or tools. It came from the air, remember? Doctors would go from performing an autopsy to delivering a baby without so much as wiping their hands on a rag, let alone using soap. This was medicine before germ theory, full of confidence, covered in blood, and absolutely spectacularly wrong. That's how you get things like puerperal fever or childbed fever, a postpartum infection that became a death sentence for thousands of women. It usually started a few days after giving birth. Fever, chills, intense abdominal pain, and it ended with sepsis, organ failure, and death. This wasn't rare. In some maternity wards, up to 30% of new mothers died. The cause? Doctors were performing autopsies in the morning and then delivering babies in the afternoon, without ever washing their hands in between. Meanwhile, gangrene was the Grim Reaper's best friend in surgical wards. It set in when wounds became infected and tissue began to die. The skin would turn black or green, smell terrible, and eventually rot off the body while the patient was still alive. If you were lucky, the limb could be amputated in time. If not, the infection would spread to your bloodstream, and you'd die painfully over the course of a couple days. Back then, it was just viewed as bad luck. Even surgeons understood that gangrene was contagious in some way. They just didn't know why or how. Some believed it was caused by bad air. Others thought it came from emotional stress. Very few considered that it maybe had something to do with sawing into somebody with a blood-soaked blade still sticky from the last guy. By the mid-1800s, hospitals had become infamous for these outcomes. It wasn't incompetence, it was ignorance. Bacteria were invisible, germ theory didn't exist yet, and antiseptics were still decades away. So, if you walked into a hospital in 1850 with a broken leg, you might leave in a coffin. You didn't go to the hospital to get better. You went because you were already out of options. After all this carnage and staggering mortality rates, a few brave souls started asking uncomfortable questions. One of the first was Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian doctor working in Vienna in the 1840s. He noticed something odd at the maternity clinic where he worked. Women in the ward, staffed by doctors and medical students, were dying of childbed fever at 3 times the rate of those cared for by midwives. Why? The doctors were doing autopsies in the morning and delivering babies in the afternoon. No hand washing, no disinfecting. Semmelweis suspected cadaverous particles were being transferred to the mothers, so he did something radical. He made everyone wash their hands in a chlorinated lime solution at Vienna General Hospital birthing ward. The results were immediate and dramatic. Maternal death rates plummeted from around 10% to 2%. It was undeniable. Semmelweis had cracked the code. And how was this discovery received? With mocking, hostility, and career sabotage. Germ theory was not a thing yet, so Ignaz didn't have an explanation as to why his experiment worked. He used a chlorine lime solution because it best removed the smell of autopsy flesh. Doctors really didn't like being told that they were killing their patients. Semmelweis was mocked, ignored, and eventually dismissed. His mental health declined under the pressure. In 1865, he was forcibly institutionalized and beaten by the asylum guards. He died of an infection, the very kind he spent his life trying to prevent. It took years after his death for his findings to be accepted. He is now honored as a pioneer of antiseptic policy and as the savior of mothers. But he wasn't alone. While doctors were arguing about bad air and hygiene, a French chemist named Louis Pasteur was busy proving that something invisible was killing people. Pasteur wasn't a physician. He was a chemist trying to solve a problem with wine. French wine and beer makers were losing fortunes because their products kept spoiling. Pasteur looked under a microscope and saw tiny organisms. In a series of brilliant experiments in the 1850s and 60s, he showed that fermentation was caused by microbes, and that heating liquids killed them. This is what we now call pasteurization. But Pasteur's real bombshell came when he tackled a theory that had haunted medicine for centuries: spontaneous generation, the idea that life could just appear out of nowhere. According to this belief, maggots emerged from rotting meat, and disease simply happened when the air got bad. In an article from the New York Tribune, Pasteur addresses spontaneous generation. The scientific world looked at him like a madman. There is no such thing as spontaneous generation. Life can only proceed from other life. Even his friend Dumas hesitated to stand by him in this. "You may be right," he said, "but you can never prove it." "But I will," replied Pasteur. And he did, with his famous swan neck flask experiment in 1861. He boiled broth in flasks with curved necks that let air in but trapped dust and microbes. No microbes grew, but when the flask was tilted, letting particles from the air reach the broth resulted in bacterial growth. The conclusion was that life doesn't spontaneously appear. Microbes come from other microbes, and they're in the air, on your hands, on your tools. Suddenly, germs were real. Pasteur had handed the medical world the microscope it needed to explain Semmelweis's success. The cause of hospital death wasn't mysterious, it was microbial. He famously declared, "It is the microbes who will have the last word." And finally, for once, science started to listen. One major problem back in the 1800s was dealing with sewage, especially since most people still believed that bad smells caused illness. In Glasgow, the city was experimenting with a solution, carbolic acid, a coal tar derivative that neutralized the smell of raw sewage. A British surgeon, Joseph Lister, had the idea that maybe if the carbolic acid reduced smells, maybe it also reduced germs. He said in an article he himself wrote, "When it had been shown by the researches of Pasteur, it occurred to me that the decomposition might be avoided by applying as a dressing some material capable of destroying life of the floating particles." He put his hypothesis to the test. In 1865, Lister soaked dressings in diluted carbolic acid and applied them to a young boy's compound leg fracture. Normally, a death sentence from infection, but this time the wound healed without festering. No pus, no fever, no gangrene. The boy lived. Lister refined his methods immediately. He soaked surgical instruments, dressings, and even air in carbolic spray. Lister said, "The material which I have employed is carbolic or phenic acid, the most powerful antiseptic with which we are at present acquainted." And just like that, antiseptic surgery was born, not from divine revelation, but from sewage. His antiseptic method slashed mortality rates. In one of his case series, post-op infection rates dropped from nearly 50% to under 15%. Lister didn't just save lives, he transformed surgery from a brutal gamble into something that could actually heal people. You would think that the medical community would have rejoiced. Instead, they said something closer to, "That smells terrible. I don't believe in invisible bugs." Doctors resented the implication that their hands were dirty. Some refused to believe that invisible particles could cause disease. After all, if you couldn't see it, how dangerous could it be? British surgeon Lawson Tate claimed that applying the carbolic acid paste actually resulted in more infection. Others accused Lister of stealing credit for antiseptics. Some just didn't have the faith in carbolic acid. The Lancet wrote in 1875, "Until Mr. Lister and his disciples can prove that the results of the antiseptic system are sufficient to compensate for the extra expenditure of money, time, and labor, it is certain that the minute details of antiseptic surgery will only be practiced by enthusiasts who have time enough for them." Likewise, James Young Simpson, the inventor of chloroform, also attacked Lister's ideas. He accused Lister of stealing other people's ideas, saying that Lister was not the first one to use carbolic acid. And this was true. Lister was not the first. He was the first, however, to use it on wounds to prevent infections. And he never did claim to be the one to come up with the carbolic acid. Simpson's true motives were discovered when he tried to promote the idea of using acupuncture to stop infections instead. Simpson cited William Pierre, who had successfully used acupuncture, but unfortunately for Simpson, Pierre wrote a replying article recommending Lister's use of carbolic acid, and that was the end of that argument. Lister, Semmelweis, and others would spend decades fighting not just infection, but the arrogance and inertia of the medical profession. Even with all this new evidence, many physicians clung to old beliefs. Germ theory was still controversial in the 1860s. Doctors didn't like being told they were the problem. After all, it's one thing to believe death is God's will. It's another to realize it's probably on your hands, literally. Plus, cleanliness was still culturally coded as fussy or even feminine, not the kind of thing a rugged, respectable man of science needs to concern himself with. Real surgeons had blood on their sleeves, not soap under their nails. The general population didn't exactly rush to embrace germ theory either. It was unsettling to think that the world was teeming with invisible monsters. And then there was the matter of smell. Early antiseptic procedures filled the air with a choking fog of carbolic acid. Hospitals suddenly stank worse than usual, which is saying something for the 19th century. Patients and visitors weren't reassured by the chemical smell. Still, momentum was building. In 1867, Lister published a paper in the Lancet detailing how using carbolic acid to clean wounds and surgical tools drastically reduced infection rates. It wasn't magic, it was just hygiene. Hospitals that adopted this method saw mortality rates drop from 45% to under 15%. Others scoffed. Lister was nicknamed the Mad Fogger for spraying his surgical rooms with disinfectant mist. The patients stopped dying, and that kind of result was hard to ignore. Meanwhile, Pasteur kept hammering the microbial message home. His experiments became textbook examples of empirical science. Germs were real, germs were dangerous, and crucially, germs could be killed. He connected specific microbes to specific diseases, anthrax, rabies, and childbed fever among them. In 1878, he told the French Academy of Medicine, "If I had the honor of being a surgeon, penetrated as I am by the dangers to which the germs of microbes expose, not only would I only use perfectly clean instruments, but after having cleaned my hands with the greatest care and having submitted them to a rapid buckling, I would only use lint strips and sponges previously exposed to air brought to a temperature of 130 to 150 Celsius. I would only ever use water that would have undergone a temperature of 110 to 120 Celsius. And slowly, resistance began to crack. Soon, even the skeptics started washing their hands. In an article in the Schachon Journal, it said, "The General Hospital at Munich had come to such a state of unhealth that fully 80% of all wounds were infected by the poisonous gangrene." A surgeon was sent to England to learn the new Listerism, and after his return, not a single case of hospital gangrene appeared. By the 1870s and 1880s, more physicians began adopting antiseptic methods, especially in countries that weren't stuck in the mud of medical tradition. German and American surgeons, in particular, started leading the charge towards sterile techniques. It wasn't until 1890 when Lister's methods had evolved into a full-on antiseptic approach, where the goal was not just killing germs, but keeping them out entirely. Gloves, sterilized instruments, and clean gowns became the norm. By the 1880s, germ theory had gone from a radical idea to medical foundation. Medical schools began teaching it. Hospitals began updating their sanitation protocols, and slowly the white-coated world began to admit that maybe, just maybe, invisible life forms were killing people, and that doctors could actually do something to prevent it. In just a few decades, medicine had gone from reeking of pus and hubris to demanding sterility and precision. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen without resistance, but it happened. Because of a handful of stubborn, brilliant people who refused to believe that pain, infection, and death were just part of the package, the rise of antiseptics also marked the beginning of professional medicine as we know it. Standards emerged, licensing tightened. No more shrugging off death as just one of those things. We recognized pus as a sign of infection instead of a sign of healing. For the first time, doctors were preventing illness instead of just treating it.